Okay, I'm Elmer Werth, born 7/2/21, and came from the Grand Round Valley Junction area in Oregon.
At the beginning of World War II, where were you and what were you doing at that time?
I was almost finished with the winter term at Oregon State. I had a couple of weeks to go when Pearl Harbor hit. And then a circular came out that was soliciting applications for weather school as a cadet if you had a certain level of math. And unfortunately, I had the math requirement, and I applied for it, and I was accepted, except that I was not going to be enlisted or signed up until the next school session opened. So I had a period of time to play ball with the draft board and try to get left off the list until I could have time to apply to accept the application to the school. And I finally managed to make it, and it was in the fall of '42 when they started Class 5 at UCLA. And we went down there, and the Army had taken over an old hotel, and in fact a couple of old hotels, and had commissioned another private outfit in another big building to supply the food. We marched from Westwood Village, the northern edge of Westwood Village, up into the UCLA campus, and took our PT in the morning till about almost 11 o'clock. Then we'd dress up and go up for a lecture for dynamic meteorology, which was poor timing. We were in no condition to listen to a boring lecture after all that exercise. But in the afternoon, we went down, of course, back to get our meals, and we marched back up to campus and spent the afternoon with Prof. Berkness. And he was the second instructor that was quite efficient. He taught what they called synoptic meteorology, and that was analysis of weather masses and the projected movements and when weather fronts and the disturbances that would occur and various things pertaining to actual weather observation and expected movement of the air masses. We really enjoyed working with him. He was quite articulate in English, and we could understand him very well. The dynamic meteorology at 11 o'clock, even if we were awake, we wouldn't have gotten much out of it because, in the first place, Humboldt couldn't speak English very well. It took us probably more than 3 weeks to figure out that Chongacheta was the tangent of theta. Anyhow, we did enjoy working with Berkness, and I think we learned quite a lot. We worked with prepared weather maps from previous history and had to analyze them for where frontal locations were and anticipated motion and forecasts for selected spots for a later day. And once in a while we'd be right. Well, after about 9 months, probably about 8 months, we were notified that we were probably going to graduate and we could order our uniforms. Then at graduation, we got our assignments, and I was sent to Columbia, South Carolina for my first post. And it was a rather small Air Force weather station. We got our information, a lot of it from pilot reports, but we did get some information from the National Weather Service of the United States, which gave us basic background of air masses and where they were located. But we didn't get a very heavily detailed map. Transmission systems weren't quite as efficient then as they are now. Well, after about a month, I hadn't been there real long, the Fort Jackson motor pool officer called up and wanted to know if he had to drain his vehicles. We did have a Canadian air mass moving towards us, but it was slowing down, and it was kind of a close call, but after looking at it for quite a while, I told him that bare chance of a very light frost, but it wouldn't be enough to hurt any vehicles. Then I didn't sleep very well that night, and that made me feel that weather forecasting wasn't yet an exact science, and I signed up for weather equipment. After another month, I got assigned to a weather equipment school in New Jersey. That was signal corps and basic electronics. Basically, I didn't know anything about vacuum tube function or any of these things, and we learned basic electronics, and then we went to work on the radio sound receiver, which was a massive cabinet full of junk, including a nice 600-volt circuit that I got a shock from one time. But I graduated from there, and then they didn't have any place for me, and I was sent back down to Wilmington, Delaware, to a weather station there. It was a much bigger station than the one at Columbia, and quite efficiently run. And Captain Kefauver was a very good guy to work with, and we got along pretty good. And then after I was there for probably 2.5 months, I got a call to go on what they called detached service down to the University of Florida at Gainesville. And under detached service, of course, Captain Kefauver was still my superior officer, so I was sent down to work for these 2 young lieutenants that were working on a new project that they'd found out about that the Dean Weil and the College of Engineering at Gainesville had promoted and worked with. So I got down there, and we found their methods were very precise. They had cameras and somehow coded a dot dash signal in the edge of the film, and they were doing triangulation on thunderstorm strikes by use of a cathode ray tube and a couple of loop antennas. And the flashes would show on the screen of the cathode ray tube, and they had labeled directions all around the tube so you could say what direction the flash came from and the magnitude of it. And by photographing it and getting simultaneous readings for sure, they had some very good results. And that encouraging these 2 other young lieutenants to think that ought to be something we could do by visual observation. Well, we worked at it for probably about 4 months or 5 down there, all learning how to do it, how to read it, and how to report it, and methods of transmission. And they brought in a radio transmitter, and we were out on grounds owned by the university quite a ways out from the main campus. We set up our little hut, truck-mounted hut that they dumped off on the ground that had transmitter and 2 receivers, and we took turns learning how to read the scope and reporting it. And then we set up stations, one in the eastern Atlantic out there on an island, and one up at New Jersey and the one there at Gainesville, and tried to take simultaneous readings on lightning flashes that would show up as a direction on this oscilloscope. In the mornings we did reasonably well sometimes. Afternoons everybody had their own thunderstorm, and we rarely would connect up with a triangulation that would work. The two southern stations, particularly Gainesville and out there in the Atlantic, they might have 6 or 8 flashes at the same time that somebody up north would call. But what we did, each station would take turn calling for 20 times on a flash that they thought was impressive. And the other 2 stations would have to try to remember what they had just seen and report direction and strength of their flash. And then all this information was sent to, I don't really know where. We radioed it in, and it went to somewhere where they did the plotting to see if we had a triangulation fix. It didn't happen in the afternoons. Everybody was looking at a different thunderstorm. But in the mornings, we occasionally did some reporting that worked. If things went well, and we happened to be looking at the same flashes, which would happen once in a while in the up to mid-morning, by noon or after, the southern stations would have maybe 6 flashes in a second or 8, and visual observation just didn't work, because there's 9 times out of 10, or even worse, we weren't all looking at the same flash. They were going to be turning it over to the National Weather Service and everybody else, airports and military things, everything, or any place we got a good triangular fix. That was a thunderstorm active area, and that went out for weather reports. But like I say, too many times our lines would go various directions and didn't cross anywhere. We packed up our equipment. Most of the college did most of that, actually. And we just went up separately to New Jersey to process for overseas shipment. Anyhow, we had to go through routine infantry training, only not quite to the extent that the infantry does. But we had to crawl under barbed wire with them firing a few shots theoretically over our head. I don't know if they were blanks or real, but I didn't stick my head up to see. And then we fired for qualification with the various weapons, little machine gun or the M1 rifle and the little carbine and our .45 pistols. I love that little carbine. That was a neat little weapon. I really liked that one. And the .45, well, I got in the general direction of the target, I think. But I made expert with a carbine. But then we had to pack everything up and headed out to San Francisco to the ship out. And we had been given a 15-day leave. Well, Elsie and I spent about 2/3 of that on the train going out to Oregon and back. We just get back to New Jersey, and then we get the orders to go to San Francisco to check out, to ship out. And I was supply representative, and I got to stay in a hotel in Frisco along with my wife, and I had to go over to Oakland and make sure our equipment got loaded onto the troop ship. And that didn't take very long, and we had several more days before they were ready to move out. So Elsie and I toured San Francisco, and We were up on top of the hill one evening. I saw the cargo ship come out of the loading pier over on the Oakland side and head across the bay towards the passenger slip near the Golden Gate Bridge. And I told Elsie, well, I won't come back the next day after I leave. And of course I had shots for, well, the worst ones were the yellow fever and the bubonic plague shots. Those two made me very, very sick. And I crawled up on the gangplank, but I could hardly make it carrying my stuff. Somebody helped me a little bit. I got to my quarters and sacked out. And that evening we slipped out onto the bridge and took off across the Pacific. The first day was pretty rough. The ground swells off the coast were making that old boiler roll pretty badly, and the crew was on a shakedown cruise too. They don't think they'd ever been to sea before. So the crew was sick, and most of the other people were sick. But I didn't quite get sick. I made it. And this trip across was relatively uneventful. The one going out, we were approaching this typhoon, and the clouds were still a long ways away, and still nice and bright where we were, but all of a sudden that ship stuck its nose under a big swell and washed a lot of money and cards off of the main deck where the guys were playing poker. Then it came back up out of it, and that was the only one. We didn't hit any more swells for probably half a day. Then we got into some real rough weather. It's sort of a challenge to walk through a narrow hatch when it turns off 30 or 40 degrees from vertical. You get a few bruises. Went to New Guinea and then up to the Philippines. Landed at Manila and went to a replacement camp there while we got our orders and got our equipment off the ship. And then we got split up into groups, and one station of mine was in the northern tip of Luzon at a tiny little town called Laog. They had another station in Manila and one in Palawan and one in Samar. And we went through our same performance as we did in the States, calling shots and taking turns calling and trying to get triangulation fixes on the location of thunderstorms. And we radioed our data into Manila. We never saw the results unless we could call and ask them later how it turned out, but it only worked in the mornings, basically, for the most part, because in the afternoons everybody was looking at a different thunderstorm. There were so many of them in all directions around, especially Palawan and Samar. We had a pretty easy setup there. We had more men than I actually needed to run the station properly, so some of us would go swimming in the China Sea, and the local weather station, I think, was a little bit short-handed, and he felt slighted, and I don't think he really appreciated us too much. But we were on one side of the strip, and he was over close to the control tower on the other side, so we weren't even close. All of our facilities were built out of bamboo by Filipino crews. We had to stay with the base quartermaster until we got our buildings built. I had to take a 6x6 and go out in the mountains with a crew of Filipinos to gather the bamboo in the first place. And the reason I'd had to drive the truck, I only had one guy in my whole staff that wasn't from the East Coast that could also drive, and he was sick that day. But we went way out in the mountains and the Filipinos cut bamboo. The stuff basically maybe 60, 80 feet high, and sometimes up to 8 inches in diameter at the bottom. It's massive stuff. And those Filipinos do amazing things with it. We had some beautiful quarters and buildings. Of course, I did a little improving too. We had 2 Jeep engine power units to supply power for the station. So we had plenty of electricity, and I stripped the wiring out of some of the old wrecked planes on the edge of the strip and some switches, and I even had 3-way switches so I could turn on a light at the entrance of the building and turn it off at my bunk. Really roughing it. Well, we got the happy news of the final surrender after the big bombs, after the atomic bombs. And of course our kids, my whole crew was ecstatic, but then they sent the manager of the station down in Manila home and sent me down there to take over that station. But the plotting crew and that organization was already established, and so I didn't tamper with that. I was still just bossing the observation crew, and I was there about 3 or 4 months before it became time for me to ship out. I had received orders to create this monstrous rhombic antenna that aimed for Tokyo, and that was interesting working with a civil engineer. He asked me why I was doing that now that the war was over, and I told him I didn't know. I just had orders to try to get it done. But he helped me, and we got it built. Basically, he got it built. They're on tall towers are probably 50 feet off the ground, or 40 at least, and it's 700 feet long on the long leg and 350 across the narrow width. It sent a knife blade signal directly to Tokyo. And we were getting in there very well with our little 350 watt transmitter. One time the base commander, the base CO, couldn't get through with their 1,000 watt down there at the regular setup on the base, and he wanted to know if we were getting through, and I said, yeah, we are. So he asked to come out and use our equipment to get contact with Tokyo, and we said, sure, of course, and he came out, and his shock when he turned on the mic was quite noticeable, because I'd had a big, beautiful pin-up given to me, and I built a light box for it and had it wired with a relay onto the mic switch so that you pressed to talk and the box would light up, and it's kind of a conversation stopper the first time you looked at it. But the CO was good-natured. He didn't say a word, but he hesitated for a minute before he started his talk. After about 3 months, they decided it was my time for me to go home. So I packed up my foot locker and took off. We got sent to the troop ship, and away we went. I came back to Frisco again, and they sent me up to Fort Lewis to be discharged. And Of course, I was in illegal uniforms. The States were still in winter uniforms, and I was in suntans. And I went to the PX, and I came back out, and the MP grabbed me and said I was out of uniform. He had to write me up. So I said, okay, I'm leaving the base tomorrow. He kind of snarled a little bit and wrote me up anyhow, but then I noticed he had a chip on his shoulder. I could see a stain on his sleeve where he had been a staff sergeant, and he just had a buck sergeant stripes there now. So he was mad at somebody. Anyhow, then I went home, and that was the end of the military part of it.
It don't mean a thing if you ain't got that swing. It don't mean a thing.
When I was hitchhiking down with our base meat wagon from the northern tip, it went down to Manila to the headquarters briefly, and the hitchhike back, I don't know if the pilot pulled up his wheels too soon or if he hit a little air gust or what, but one side of the plane dropped enough that he tore off the whole front of the motor. And we went off the edge of the cliff with the hammering along with one engine, and the pilot yelled back, "Unload this thing." So one of the enlisted men that was also hitchhiking on the plane knew how to unlatch the cargo door from inside. And we started unloading cases of meat and all kinds of stuff as we flew, and he finally got enough elevation to get back to the strip. The strip was on a kind of a bench above the valley nearby, so we had a chance to lose elevation for a little while and still be safe, and we flew down this valley, and after we got unloaded, he managed to climb back up enough to make it back to the strip. It was a rough landing because if you're pulling on one engine, you're not going in the same direction that the plane is pointed. You're kind of at an angle. So it snapped around with a jerk when our wheels hit. And then the pilot yelled that he didn't have any hydraulics, no brakes, so we piled off the edge of the strip into the sand and ran into a sand dune and got bumped a little bit, but this main structure of the plane didn't get hurt, so, no major damage, just a few bruises.
The plane was probably put back in service the same day, I would imagine.
What's that?
I says that plane was probably put back into service the same day. Yeah.
Take more than that to put a new motor in it.
Those guys worked fast and hard.
Because that propeller and reduction gears and the whole cotton pickers works went off somewhere.